All right, Dave, let's talk about Iran. You have a couple articles from yesterday here. The first one I want to talk about is titled White House Warns Time Running Out to Revive Iran Deal. Dave, I feel like they've been saying we're weeks away from having to, the Iran deal. We can't return to it for a couple months now. So I'm not sure how seriously you're taking the U.S. threats. However, I have seen more and more reporting from places like the Wall Street Journal and these mainstream news outlets that the U.S. does, or at least people within the U.S. are assessing that the breakout time for Iran's nuclear program is less than a year, which me and doesn't mean anything, but for the debate in D.C. it may be quite important. So, what's going on here?
Yeah, I would be really shocked. I mean, so Saki, they've been warning this the whole time since the talks ended. Since the talks resumed at the end of November, that, we have a short time. The talking point is that if Iran makes more nuclear advancements, the JCPOA would be kind of useless. It wouldn't do what it's supposed to do. But that's just not true at all because Iran will bring its nuclear program into the limits of the JCPOA. The idea is they say, oh, they're like gaining more knowledge about how to make a nuclear weapon, I guess, but they're not trying to make a nuclear weapon. So it's all just that talking point is total nonsense, but it plays well in the U.S. media. And then the breakout time thing, that's also just nonsense. But what the big problem is the opposition in Congress. I mean, you have pretty much every Republican is against it, and you have Bob Menendez, who's pretty influential, who's also very against it. So, and Iran has to look at this too, because this is a big thing for them, is the guarantees that they want guarantees the next administration won't pull out of the deal. Well, Republicans, it's tough to predict things. Things can change very quick when it comes to electoral politics, but Republicans are looking pretty good for the next presidential election with what's been happening with Biden. So from Iran's perspective, they might only have a short window of this sanctions relief. And, judging by how long the U.S. can take to lift sanctions, they might not even get them all lifted within 2 years or 3 years. So Iran's not going to really make any big concessions to the U.S., I don't think, to get the U.S. to rejoin the deal, because in the long term, they can't really plan their economy based around this deal that might be gone soon. So at the same time, the U.S. officials, the line now, they're saying a deal is in sight. A deal for all parties is in sight. Something could happen soon. But I don't know, just the way that the pressure is against the deal in Washington, and just the reality of it, and the fact that Iran will just see little benefit even if the sanctions are lifted, doesn't give me much hope for it.
Yeah. So, yeah, it seems to me that Biden made a huge mistake here, Dave, that, getting back into the deal when he first took over the presidency would have been a lot easier, but now he's waited so long that, with the maximum pressure campaign that Biden has added sanctions to as president. It's not just that he sat on his hands. He sat on his hands while Israel, launched asymmetric warfare attacks against Iran. And then, he added his own sanctions to Iran. So Iran continued, to advance their civilian nuclear energy program by installing new centrifuges and everything like that. And my understanding is the Iranians are saying this time that they're unwilling to destroy those centrifuges. And so the U.S. argument is that even if Iran ships off all of its enriched uranium, with its ability to enrich uranium to 60%, which they've now proven, they could theoretically have enough enriched uranium to produce a bomb in 4 to 6 months. However, the whole conversation isn't relevant because Iran doesn't have a bomb, and even having enough enriched uranium to make a bomb doesn't mean that you have one. There's still quite a few steps between those two processes that everybody seems to just like to jump and forget. But anyways, now the Hods have, I think, enough ammunition, especially, with it being a new government in Iran that is less friendly towards the West at the very least. And so I think Biden has put himself in a really tough place on this issue. And for the Iranians, he's put them in a really tough place as well, because now he's drug his feet so long that the Houthis are just gonna go crazy and threaten the Iranians directly, like they did in 2014, 2015. Hell, back then even Rand Paul, not Ron Paul, Ron Paul's great. Rand Paul was signing letters to the Iranian government saying, "Don't get into the deal because the Republican president is just gonna pull the plug on. Don't do it. Don't do it." And so I can see all that kind of stuff happening, and the Iranians saying, "Well, you know what? That's a pretty damn good point." And so yeah, never mind about this.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you have also the pressure from Israel. Another thing I wrote up recently was Biden and Bennett, the Israeli prime minister. They spoke the other day on the phone, and this was from Axios. Some sources told them that Bennett pretty much said to Biden, don't join the deal. You don't have to do it. It's interesting. He said that Iran's nuclear program won't necessarily advance if the deal isn't revived, which is funny because you always hear the Israelis warning that they're racing to make a bomb, but now that he's really trying to convince Biden not to do it, he kind of changes his tune. So that's a whole nother element to it. Biden also told Bennett that that he supports Israel's freedom of action against Iran, which kind of signals that they might back some potential military or covert action against the Iranians. And these are all signals to Iran, and they're not good signals. So they're just not giving them much to work with here.
Yeah, yeah. So this really, I had to read it a couple times, Dave, just to make sure I was reading this right yesterday, because as you say, the Israeli warning is always that Iran is going to build a bomb, that the Iran nuclear deal doesn't constrain Iran enough, and that if it wasn't for the crippling sanctions that the U.S. currently has against Iran, would have a nuclear bomb. And it seems that Israel is basically admitting that all those things just simply aren't true. They're, saying that Iran isn't racing to build a bomb. It's not some kind of deal keeping them from getting them. And they say, Iran isn't going to build it with or without sanctions. And so that seems all really problematic. Now, one more thing I want to mention to you and just hear your take on. FDD's Mark Dubowitz said that here's the problem. If we get back into the deal now, it will lift sanctions on Iran, and then in 5 or 6 years, Iran will do, he doesn't say this, but Iran will do what Russia did, sanction proof its economy, and then the U.S. will have no leverage on Iran to prevent them from making, or no peaceful leverage on Iran to prevent them from making a nuclear bomb, like applying sanctions, and we'll have no choice but to go to war. And that's kind of the Houth's argument, I guess, now that, why we can't return to the deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because what they're trying to do now is sanctions proof their economy, because they can't rely on the U.S. to keep sanctions off. So even if they return to the deal, there is some truth to that they're still going to try to sanctions proof their economy, but that makes sense. I mean, I don't see what other option they really have. And as the U.S. is pushing all of its, so-called enemies closer together, there is like some real avenues for Iran to take with Russia and China. And as they're working on this kind of alternate global financial economic system. But, that's all entirely the U.S. is doing. And that there's no reason we would have to go to war with them, even if that's just all nonsense. It's not like they're going to make a nuke or anything or try to destroy Israel like Dubowitz says. But yeah, I mean, these policies, the pressure, that's what's going to cause any of that situation, that Iran, seeking alternatives, and that's already started. This whole time you hear Iranian officials, they say they want to restore the deal. They're willing to go back into the JCPOA if the U.S. lifts sanctions, but they're also working for alternatives. And you see, Iran's economy has grown a little recently. It really took a hit after the Trump administration put all these sanctions on. but it's kind of slowly been growing. So they are getting by, and so that could be their long-term plan, no matter what happens with these negotiations, and it would make sense to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess, Iran has several examples looking at Russia, North Korea, Iraq, Libya, all these places where, the U.S. either just opposes sanctions completely arbitrarily or says they're going to remove them and then walks back on it even after the concessions are made. They have their own example. And so it seems like Iran probably won't open its economy up and, become like supply chain dependent for things it needs to keep its civilians alive on anyone that could be sanctioned by the United States. And so that basically means just the other countries that are so heavily sanctioned that they're willing to trade, which mostly includes Russia, although I think there's still some hesitation there because they don't face the same kind of sanctions that like Venezuela does, which is doing a lot more trade with Iran. And apparently Iran has helped Venezuela to increase its oil export, double it in 2021 with what the Iran is shipping to Venezuela. Dave, before we move on, I just want to mention to the audience that me and Will Porter have a new article out on sanctions at the Libertarian Institute today. So if you want to go over there and check that out. But Dave,